everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm very excited to be talking about Wagenaer because, as mentioned, I began a PhD on him in 2021 when I was still living in Brazil, and then moved back to South Africa, but was doing a postdoc, and am still doing a postdoc at Stellenbosch on other things. But I have recently been, in preparation for this talk, I have been sort of sneakily moving towards maybe doing the PhD or something with this again. So I have been going back through all my notes, and I'm working towards something. See the space one day in the distant future. I don't know how long it will take. So there are very many ways of pronouncing this man's name: Zacharias Wagenaer, Wagenaer, Wagenaer. There are different spellings depending on where he was in the world and at what point of his career, whether he was more German at the time or Dutch. There have been different spellings here in South Africa as well. So I tend to say Zacharias Wagenaer or Wagenaer, but I might go between them. It's all the same. It also depends on what time period I'm talking about. So I want to first start by talking about the world at the time, where we start with the Age of Discovery, where ships were going out, finding new lands, new people, and we get to a point of knowledge circulation, where this new knowledge is then taken back and shared. And in the 17th century, this knowledge circulation increased more than it had before, because we get the big companies, these conglomerates, these merchant enterprises coming along and making a point of going out into the world and looking at what they can exploit. And so the thing to remember, like the VOC, like the West India Company, these were conglomerates, they were merchant enterprises. It was not the state, it was not the Dutch state that came to the Cape or to Japan or wherever else they went. So we all know about the VOC, and that it was started in 1602, and that it had the monopoly of trade. I'm pointing in this direction, but I think you will be thinking in that direction. But so they had the monopoly of trade from the Cape all the way along the east, and it has been described as a knowledge-creating company, obviously not at the time, but later on by scholars who looked at it as not just this merchant enterprise, that really they were finding new ways and recording all this and sending it back home. Then in 1621, we have the West India Company. The West India Company had all the trade to the west, so that's in the Atlantic world. And both of these companies, the point was to seek out elements and things that they could exploit, that they could make money from. This was money making. It was all about money, 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 money. So what happens as a consequence of looking for things to exploit, places to exploit, is that they are interacting with new lands, new people, flora, fauna, cultures, foods, and objects. And this is an inevitable consequence which has benefited us for hundreds of years. I'm going to be a little bit boring, talking technically now for a moment about networks of knowledge and exchange and production. Now, there's an old idea that the central node was always going to be in Europe, and that they imported the raw information from the periphery. So the periphery was all the colonies and settlements and places all around the world, and that then this raw information was then cooked, as it were, in the central area of Europe, and then by cooked they mean the processed knowledge, and then that processed knowledge is then exported back out to the rest of the world. But actually it's a lot more complex than this, and as I said, it's quite an old-fashioned idea. The three elements of networks that I want to talk about very briefly is that actually the central nodes of knowledge production are not at the center in Europe. They're actually on the periphery, because it's here at places like the Cape, in Batavia, all over the world, different colonies, settlements. That's where information was being gathered, it was adapted, appropriated, it was also misunderstood, and it was recorded, very importantly, and turned into practical knowledge. And yes, that information would eventually make its way back to Europe, but the people here on the ground, they didn't know how it was being used in Europe and what was being done with it. They were using it in a practical way for their day-to-day life. And the important thing to remember is that these people at the periphery in these nodes of knowledge creation were actually very ordinary people. These were the ordinary sailors and soldiers who were often uneducated or had minimal education. They were merchants and officials, and also the indigenous people with whom they interacted. So it was a complex system, and it was never just the Europeans themselves. There was always an interaction happening. And then the third thing to remember is that people who worked in the VOC or the West India Company, they often worked there for many, many years and traveled very widely. They wouldn't be stationed only in one place. They might go off to different places, have promotions, want to see different parts of the world, or be sent there for whatever reason. And so what happens then is that knowledge production becomes accumulative, where you get say knowledge of how things are at the Cape, and that's able to influence knowledge about how things are, or what you can do in Batavia or in Japan, as we will see with Wagenaer. Okay, so academics like to talk about VOC or West India Company. I usually call it WIC. I don't know if that's an accepted term for it, but it's much easier than saying West India Company. So they're known as servants to the company, or global servants, and Wagenaer has been described as the ultimate, because he was in the company, the two companies, for almost 40 years, and he traveled so widely, and there was so much that he achieved really during that time. I haven't listed all the different ways that he spelled his name, but there are various ones. Okay, so I'm going to start with a little brief biography about Wagenaer. He was born in Dresden in 1614, and his father was an artist and a public official, a magistrate, I believe. And Wagenaer, he studied drawing and copper engraving, and at the age of 19, he leaves home, goes on his own to Amsterdam, and he manages to get work with the Blaus, which was really, this was a company of the finest map makers and publishers, and they were, slightly later, they became the official map makers for the VOC. And what's extraordinary about this opportunity is that he's working on making these maps. He's seeing the world through these maps, through the drawings that he's having to do, and he gets excited about it, and he wants to go out and explore. So he's only there for about a year, and then he joins the WIC as a common soldier. Just one thing about the maps, they had a lot of them working on the maps all together, because maps at the time, they didn't last very long, because they're constantly finding out new up-to-date things. So a map, you wouldn't, a sailor on a ship wouldn't keep it and treasure it. It would be for use, and next trip you need a new one because it's been damaged or because it's out of date now. So they were constantly making these new maps. It took 6 weeks to get to Brazil. Very shortly after arriving, he is promoted to a clerk or a scribe. He's got beautiful handwriting, which I'll show you a little bit later. which was really a boon at the time because many people were illiterate or could barely write legibly. So he's very sought after for his handwriting. And then a couple of years later, Dutch Brazil gets a Governor General, Johann Moritz von Nassau-Sagan. Also with him, there are various spellings of his name depending on the language and the place and the time. But that's a basic version of his name. Okay, then at the age of 28, Wagenaer joins the VOC. He took four months off, he went home, he took 4 months off, and then he got itchy feet. And he goes off to Batavia, and he's again a clerk and a map designer. Then he gets promoted and becomes a junior merchant in the East Indies generally. And then he's promoted again, and he's the leader or the second in command of trade embassies to Taiwan, Tonkin, Queenam, Canton, Makassar, and Java. And then promoted again to Opperhoofd, or the chief of the Dutch factory at Deshima in Japan. Then becomes the city architect of Batavia. I think architect is a bit of an exaggeration. He was involved in building, in controlling or having a say in what buildings were built, rather than necessarily being completely responsible for the design of them, although that was part of it. And then in 1662, he comes to the Cape, where he is commander. He's very ill, he's in bad health, so he only stays for 4 years, but he's unable to retire properly from the company. He spends another 2 years in Batavia and then returns as Vice Admiral of the Return Fleet in 1668, and then dies shortly after arrival in Europe at the age of 54, an old, worn-out, tired, sick man. And, you know, you look at that age, 54, I'm not far off that. And I just, it's quite depressing. Okay. So, what makes Wagenaer so unique? Well, it's the extent of his travels in the Dutch colonial world. As you could see from that brief biography, basically he went everywhere. It's also the fact that we have formal and informal records from him, which is not very usual. While the VOC did keep amazing records, to have both informal and formal records is unusual. So the formal records are his dagregisters or journals from his time in Japan and at the Cape, and also some formal letters. And then the informal records comprise his tierboek, which I'll talk about in a moment, and his autobiographical sketch. So the tierboek, let me just get my books here. Oh, I'm missing one. Oh, here it is. Oh, sorry. So I have worked from 2 examples. The primary one which I worked from is this one which I bought in Brazil, which is known as Zubiblion, and it has the original German and then a translation into Portuguese. So this is useless if you don't read German or Portuguese. There is a South African one by O.H. Spoor, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, which is translated into English. It's not, I don't believe it's quite thorough enough, and they don't have all of the plates included. So the pictures, they only have a few of them, whereas this one is much more thorough. But if you want an English one, this is the only one to get. It also has the English of his autobiographical sketch, which he wrote near the end of his life. Okay, so the full title, which I don't speak German, I won't pretend to, but if you're interested, that's the full title in German, and it's basically a short description of 35 years traveling with the VOC and the West India Company. And this is one of the pictures you can see on the side there that he did when he was in Brazil, and I'll talk about that more in a moment. Okay, so in Brazil, he arrives in 1634. He's there for 7 years. And as I said, he's got beautiful handwriting. I'll show that in a moment. So he's a scribe and then a personal secretary. And we have the Governor General Maurits, who is later known as the Humanist Prince. And the thing that is really exciting and important about him, and I could talk about him for ages and ages, but he came to Brazil wanting to start a humanist or Renaissance court where people were studying and learning and engaging with their environment and the world around them. So when he comes out to Brazil, he brings 6 artists and scientists, and their job is to understand the natural world around them. He also builds 2 palaces with gardens and menageries, and these gardens and menageries are built to understand not only the local animals, the local flora and fauna, but also animals and flora from all over the world. So it's kind of like trying to show this is what we've conquered. We've conquered so much, and here it is in our control. He also has an observatory built from which they study the skies. He is involved in several military campaigns. This is because the Portuguese were there before the Dutch came, and so there was some strife with the Portuguese who were still living there. And Wagenaer would have accompanied him as his personal secretary on those campaigns, and he would have used those opportunities with the other artists that were there, the official artists, to see the natural world and the indigenous people. This picture over here is of I'm afraid it's not a very good one. It shows the slave market, and the black bunches, those are slaves, just hordes of slaves. And he writes a description of this in his Tier book, which is really sympathetic to the slaves, talking about how frightened they are, how starving and hungry and frightened and afraid and barely clothed. And I'm not sure if you're able to see, if I run up here quickly. Here's a man with his arms up being inspected. Here's another one crawling on the ground. Here they are huddled together, and here hordes of them huddled together. So this was a reality of what was going on in Brazil. They didn't like to use, as in in the Cape, they didn't like to use the local people. They imported slaves instead. Maurits, as I said, he excused this very poor picture, which I stole off the internet. I have a much better one, and I just haven't been able to find it, to show the control he had with the gardens that he was producing, where you can see how everything is very organized here, very neat. And they brought in fully grown adult coconut palms that they brought to thousands of them to line avenues, and everything was made to create a paradise, to show this is the exotic world that belongs to me, that I've created, that I've discovered. So it really was about display and show. 2 of the people that Maurits brought with him from Europe were George Markgrave or Markgraaf and Willem Piso, and they wrote together the Historia Naturalis Brasiliae, which was the first natural history of Brazil. George Markgraaf was he was an educated man, university educated. He came out to learn about the natural world, whereas Willem Piso was the Count's physician, and he was there to look at medicinal use of plants and find out traditional medical treatments. Markgrave, something happened somewhere, and this we don't know, but he was very suspicious. He thought that someone was going to try and steal his work, so he wrote his notes in code. He then, when they were all going to leave Brazil and go back to the Netherlands, he had to give all his notes to Maurits, and for no reason at the last minute, Maurits sends him off to Angola, and he dies in Angola. And his brother later on says he was murdered. And then I will talk about that in a second. So, the first Historia Naturalis Brasiliae came out in 1648. It was a massive success all over the Western world, really made a big impression, amongst others on Linnaeus and on a man in Denmark whose name I won't try to pronounce, but which sounds or looks like old worm. I don't know really what it is, how you would pronounce it properly. Anyway, so 1658, Piso brings out a second edition. He changes the title, and he also changes a lot of the writing. He makes up things or adjusts it or adds little things so that it looks like he's written it himself. But he doesn't know what he's talking about. He gets very confused. He's contradicting. He's making things up. And basically when the book comes out, and he doesn't acknowledge Markgraf. So when the book comes out, people accuse him of plagiarism, and this is also where the accusation of murder comes in, where they say you murdered him so that you could take credit and keep the book for yourself. And Piso says, why would I murder him? He was actually my servant, so anything he did was my property. This was another outrageous thing to say, because Markgraf came from a very good family. He was university educated. He was a man in his own right, with his own skills, and there was no way that he would have been the servant of Piso. So Piso becomes really despised, and Linnaeus despises him most of all, so much so that when he finds an unnamed, thorny, ugly, bristly plant, he names it after Piso. Okay, so here, I don't know if you can see very well, but that's Wagenaer's handwriting. And even though you can't see it up close, you can see that it's very neat. He's written in beautiful straight lines. I have, 2 years ago, I did spend quite a bit of time trying to read his handwriting. Of course, it is difficult when you're dealing with a different language from a different century, and they had multiple ways of drawing different letters, so it did take quite a bit of time, but it really is a consistent and neat handwriting. And so what he writes in the introduction to his Tier book is that he has been in Brazil and he wants to present, this is just a little thing that he's done, not for any official purposes, but because he wants to show the people and friends back home the truth of what things look like. Remember, he worked with maps, he worked with publishing before he came out, and so he saw that there was a lot that was untrue or not realistic, and so he's very clear about that. And he writes about this crab here that he wasn't quite able to finish the drawing because it stank so badly that he couldn't, and he wasn't going to make it up. And there's another sketch that he's done of a turtle's shell, just an empty shell, and he says, I'm not going to make up the legs and the head because that wouldn't be the truth. I'm going to do it properly as I see it. So there are 110 drawings, 73 are animals, then 19 fruit or roots, 18 are ethnographic, and there's one of the sugar mill, which was still from the Portuguese time when they were producing sugar. Here's another example of one of his sketches. This is of a stingray, some insects that he's done. And this is the cashew fruit. I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with it here. Having lived in Brazil, I can say that it is horrible. It looks so delicious, but as soon as you taste it, it makes your mouth go completely dry. It's a horrible sensation. But so what's interesting here is that he's shown it in two different ways. He's shown it on the branch still, so you can see how it hangs down. That's the fruit, and then that little curl at the end, that's the actual nut, the cashew nut. And then he's also shown it picked. And what other artists like Mark Graff did when he was in Brazil is he would also show them sliced. So Wagenaer hasn't gone quite as far as that. But he writes here that all Brazil is covered in this tree, so we get a context about this tree, that it's how many there are, how prolific, that it has a sweet juice, which is true, it does. And he said that the nuts are better than almonds, and that they roast them with salt normally, and that the indigenous people make a cashew fruit wine. And he gives more details, like they start growing in December, and that's when people are constantly looking for them. So it's just a short paragraph, but he's giving basic information. And this is the indigenous tribe of the Tapuya, who he saw dancing in this way on one of his campaigns that he went on. And he describes them as singing and dancing for hours on end. He's also, this is a Mulher Negra, which is the Portuguese. So it's interesting that he's chosen to write her description in Portuguese here. And this would have been a slave woman from Africa. And this is a Mameluca, who that was the name for the offspring, the female offspring of indigenous what they called Indian tribes, with the European soldiers or whoever was there. So it's of people of native Indian and European extraction. And what he writes about them is that they're clearly much more civilized than the Mulher Negra, because look at how much clothing she's got on, and he even says on Sundays they wear beautiful outfits, get really dressed up. So there's a differentiation between different kinds. Okay, now we are going to jump forward to Japan, to the city of Nagasaki and to the little island of Deshima, where in 1641, what happened was that for quite a while, the Japanese have been wanting to practice isolationism, where they didn't want any outsiders coming in. They wanted to keep their culture, not have it threatened. So they kicked out all the other European traders, and they said only the Dutch can stay. This was partly because the Dutch were Protestant, and so not really forcing their religion, whereas the Portuguese and the Spanish were Catholic, and the Japanese really had a problem with the Catholics. So they put them on this little island here, this fan-shaped island, and this became the hub, the center, the only place where the Japanese would get information about Europe, and the only place where Europeans would get information about the Japanese. And it was basically a prison. There was a drawbridge in the front with guards, and that linked it to the mainland. There was a fence all around, and then on the side here was a sort of a port or dock where the ships would come, and merchandise would be put in or out, but the crew from these ships were not allowed to set foot on the island. No wives, no children. They did allow prostitutes to come in, but only for a night at a time. They had to leave the next morning. And there'd be about 15 to 20 Dutch men living on the island at a time, depending on the time of year. They had to pay rent for the privilege of living in this prison. There were a couple of buildings when they moved in, but they basically had to build their own buildings. They had to furnish them themselves. They did have a vegetable garden because they also had to feed themselves, and they also had a little flower garden. just so that they had somewhere to go have a little stroll, and also later on to grow medicinal plants. So the Opperhoofd, or the head or captain, could only serve for a period of 1 year at a time. You could serve multiple times, but as long as it wasn't 2 years in a row, because they didn't want any kind of relationship building up where there could be conspiracies or rebellions or anything happening. So Wagenaer serves twice, in 1657 and again in 1659. And one thing that he did, which was very daring because he tended to be a well-behaved, good guy, was that he made sure that he read the Bible to his men every single night. Now, this was completely illegal. There were no Bibles allowed anywhere in Japan. There were no icons, nothing to do with Christianity in any kind of way was allowed. Yet he'd managed to smuggle a Bible through, and he read with them and prayed with them every night, which would have led probably to his imprisonment and death if he'd been found out. The Opperhoofd was known in Japan as Uranda Kapitan, obviously captain, and Uranda comes from the Dutch word Urania, which they then sounded to them like Uranda, and it's just because of the Dutch flag being orange, although some people say it's because many of the Dutch sailors had orange hair. I'm not sure. One of the things that they had to do, and it was the only time that they were allowed off the island, was the annual trip to Edo, called the Hofreis, when they had to go and give gifts to the shogun. It was, not enough that they already had to pay rent, an exorbitant amount of rent for the privilege of living in this prison. They also had to then go and give very expensive gifts to the emperor to say thank you for allowing us to be here. And it was a journey that took 3 months by land and sea. It always happened at a time that was decided by the emperor. They would say, when to come, but it was more or less always around about the same time. And you can see by this picture the number of porters and people involved to carry all the gifts to the emperor. And when Wagenaer went for his first meeting with the emperor, he was told there are to be no dealings with the Portuguese. If we find that the Dutch are in any way dealing with the Portuguese, you're out. And that he must also report on Catholic expansion. They were terrified of Catholicism spreading through Japan and the rest of the world. You can see here the journey took 961 kilometers all the way from Deshima in the corner there to Edo at the top or middle. And it really was an exhausting, long, burdensome voyage. Some of the gifts, they really wanted what they considered technology. So things like mirrors, telescopes, medicinal herbs, spectacles, medicine, books on anatomy, or little statues showing the anatomy of the human body. Globes were very popular, clocks and pocket watches. In fact, on one of his journeys, I can't remember now which one, Wagenaer was told to bring a surgeon with him. So that was part of the gift, not giving the surgeon to the emperor, but bringing the surgeon along, and that surgeon would then educate other people, inform them about medicine and treatment. And later on, they also sent young boys to the island to learn Dutch and to learn how to read medicinal texts. Also, animals were a big favorite. Ostriches, Dalmatians, and greyhounds were very popular. Elephants and peacocks and turkeys were also very popular, considered to be exotic. Then, we have the Great Fire of Edo in 1657, and there were constantly fires in this place. It was known as the city of fires, actually the city of fights and fires, because there were a lot of fights as well. And the reason why there were so many fires, I think I was reading a statistic this morning that in over a period of 200 years, there were almost 2,000 fires in this city, in comparison to Osaka, where there were, in the same amount of time, there were only 8. So this city, it was really cramped. There were a lot of people living there. The houses and palaces were made of wood and paper. And because of its setting, it was in a valley, the winds came really strong, and this was in winter, so everyone's got a fire to keep them warm. And what happened was, in this fire, tens of thousands of people burnt to death, or were also just really severely wounded or left homeless. And Wagenaer writes about walking around trying to find their way, where to go, what to do, fleeing the fire, and just seeing these thousands and thousands of dead bodies, a third of which were children. And the problem now is that the city has burnt to the ground. People are starving. They don't have anywhere to live. They're freezing cold. There's nowhere to go. There's no food. The emperor is not helping anyone. And also the Dutch had to hang around. They weren't allowed to leave until they were given permission to leave. So they had to hang around until eventually they're told, okay, you can leave. But then not too long afterwards, when they got back to the island, they received a letter from the emperor saying, oh, some of the gifts you brought me have burnt in the fire, so you must send more. Okay, we are, I don't know what our time is looking like. What?
Well, take as much time as
Take as much time as I need, okay, well. Okay, now we're moving on to the Cape of Good Hope. I focused on these 3 areas rather than on the little bits in between, because this is where we have the most information. So 1662 to 1666 is when Wagenaer came and was the commander. He came after Jan van Riebeeck, and he was actually the only German commander that the Cape ever had. I'll say that in a minute. Okay, so what happened is, by this point in his career, Wagenaer is old and tired and sick. He has gout, really bad gout, that sometimes has him laid up for 2 weeks at a time. He wants to retire, and he thinks, going to the Cape, wow, that sounds like a cushy, lovely job. If I apply to be commander of the Cape, that's basically like retirement. I won't have much to do. I can just sit by the seaside and relax. And this is also, the reason he applies to the Cape is also because his wife does not want to make the long journey home from Batavia to the Netherlands, which could take 6 months. And she was a lot older than him, I think about 16 years older than him. So she wasn't in particularly good health either. They get this position at the Cape. He arrives at the Cape, and wow, it is nothing like the luxury that he's experienced even in Japan, where yes, they were basically imprisoned, but they had the finer things in life. Remember, the Cape at this time, it had only been going for a very few number of years. They were still trying to establish everything. The people that were there were not the highest class of people, and you're not going to arrive and find intellectual stimulation. You're not going to have the finest things in life. You might not even have that much food always. He and his wife were only given 2 small rooms that had no beautiful paintings hanging in them. They had, if they were lucky, a stinky lion pelt. So it really wasn't the place that he had anticipated coming to for a lovely retirement. Now, he had, both in the Cape and in Japan, been known as the Donnerman. This is for his fiery temper, his bad moods, for shouting a lot. And it's no different at the Cape, where he is just known. He's gone down in history, quite unkindly, I would say, as just being a bad-tempered, grumpy, terrible man. He begs to leave, but it takes a while to get a replacement. In the meantime, his wife dies, and she's buried here at the Cape. Now, as I said, he has a very bad reputation, and earlier historians do go on a bit about this. But bear in mind, he comes after Jan van Riebeeck, who, basically anything Jan van Riebeeck managed to do was better than nothing, because before he built something from nothing. And then later on we get Simon van der Stel, who also is considered as doing amazing things. But remember that in only 4 years, so 4 years of being very sickly and unwell, he does achieve a lot. I can't see very well, the sun's shining on here now. Okay. He works on the fort, which at that time is just a wooden structure which is constantly collapsing. So he works on improving it. He even sends the Heeren 17 a scale model, which we're not sure if he actually made. He said he was going to make it, but perhaps ill health meant that someone else made it. He adds a hospital. He adds slave quarters. He designs and builds the reservoir or waterbak for the sailors, which you can still see some of the remains of that, the ruins at the Goue Akker, is that it? Goue Akker in town, although I will say that Dr. Slay said to me that he had his doubts that that was actually what it was. And I will always bow down to his superior knowledge. So who knows what that is? He also built a marketplace so that people could sell their wares. Very importantly, he created a school for children, for the children of freeburgers who had to pay a small fee, but also slave and Khoisan children were welcome, and it was completely free for them. He also made a start on the castle, lays the first foundation stone for it. He visits the Kochokwa with Kratoa, who it is, yes, he didn't like her very much. He thought that she was flighty and unreliable, and but I'll talk about that a bit more later. He manages in all this time to keep the peace with the tribes. He is very careful to not take sides. He's very careful to make sure that none of the freeburgers, none of the sailors or soldiers instigate any kind of difficulty or strife between them. And this is a big thing, that he's able to maintain that in all that time. He arranges several journeys to the interior to go and look for the great wealth of Monomotapa. He also personally supervises planting plants. He gets a permanent predicant to come to the Cape, because before it was just relying on whoever happened to be visiting at the time. And then he takes under his wing George Frederick Vrede, who wrote the first Hottentot Dutch dictionary, and he sends it off to the Heeren 17 and sings the praises of Vrede. And they do print some copies, although as far as I've been able to find, I don't think any of those exist, and it's not known whether they did actually reach the Cape. So this is a lot, but there's even more, okay? He does complain about the freeburgers a lot. He says they're depraved, they're lazy, they're drunks. They treat their servants badly, and this was before slavery, so these were Dutch servants that were sent out from the Netherlands. And he wants them deported to Mauritius, and he does actually manage to send 3 families there to banish them there. So, okay, maybe this is a little bit draconian, but it does show that he's trying to better the settlement in some way. The other thing is that he's absolutely disgusted. I said there are no luxuries when he arrives. And remember that he was living in Japan. He had, in fact, in Japan, been involved in designing some of the patterns for porcelain. Unfortunately, it's not known if any of those still exist, but I think it was a blue flower, maybe with some yellow and white. I can't exactly remember. But, so, he is completely horrified when he comes to the Cape and people are eating out of shells, eating out of their hands, little wooden bowls, whatever they can find. So he asks Batavia several times, we desperately need potters, we need them. And eventually they must have sent them because in 1665 he's able to write in the journal, this morning for the first time diverse kinds of baked and glazed earthenware were taken from the oven in the new pottery and found to be very good. So this was a great triumph for him. He, as I mentioned, when he was on Deshima, he made sure that they read the Bible every night. He led them in prayer. And this carried on in the Cape, where in 1666, a visiting predicant was asked to lead a service, and he refused to baptize a slave girl. And Wagenaer was very upset by this and called a meeting of the Politieke Raad, and it was decided that any slave child can be baptized at any time, and so that child is baptized the next Sunday. He also makes sure that Krotoa is baptized and is influential in her marrying Pieter van Meerhof, who she's been living with in sin for a number of years. And, you know, this is also shaky ground. Did he force her into it? Was she a willing participant? Either way, I think it's difficult to really say whether this should be something that he's particularly remembered for. Okay. So to summarize, we have this man who's traversed most of the known world for almost 4 decades, and what he's able to do is create these accumulative nodes and centers of knowledge where he is gathering information and finding ways to live and then able to take them with him. So, for example, the knowledge about pottery. From his time in Japan, he's able to come to the Cape and bring that with him and insist that that becomes part of daily life in the Cape. He's also, from his time in Brazil, he learned about promoting knowledge and understanding and education, and so he does that with the dictionary with Vrede. This is something we didn't talk about very much, but he was a sort of a builder, architect in Batavia. That also becomes part of his role in the Cape, where he's involved in all these building projects. And the wonderful thing, as I said, that we have is his documents about this. So the official, here we have his dagregister from the Cape. There are online, you can get his dagregisters from Japan. I think someone whose name I can't remember now has worked on an English translation of, I think, all the dagregisters from Japan. And I'm not sure if they've been published yet. They were severely slowed down by the pandemic, so I'm not sure. But the information is available. It's just not always available in the language you might want it to be. And really what I'd like to say about Wagenaer is this was a man who never achieved anything extraordinary. You know, he's not going to go down in history as one of the most important men, but yet he did have an impact everywhere he went, and in his service to this company that he worked for, he was able to achieve welcome and good things, and I find him endlessly fascinating, and I think probably because he is so ordinary and doing quite ordinary things, but that have meaning. Okay, that's it. Thank you.